The summer heat pressed hard over Asheville that morning. Dust drifted through the empty street as a lone pickup rattled past the old bridge. Behind the wheel sat Tom Carter, a war veteran, with nothing left but a dog named Duke and a memory he couldn't escape. His wife was gone, his home no longer his. And somewhere beyond those pine-covered hills lay the cabin his father built decades ago, the one everyone said was cursed. Tom never believed in curses, but when Duke began barking at the floorboards that night, he'd realize some legacies are buried for a reason. Please support us by subscribing to our channel. The heat over Asheville pressed down like a heavy hand, thick with the scent of pine resin and road dust. The sky was a white blaze, humming with insects that seemed to echo the restless thoughts in Tom Carter's mind. He drove the old Ford pickup along the winding back roads, its paint sun-faded, the air conditioner long dead, the only breeze the dry wind that slipped through the open window. At 48, Tom had the look of a man carved from old timber, tall, lean, with weathered skin and deep lines etched by desert winds and sleepless nights. His dark blonde hair had begun to silver near the temples, and a faint scar traced along his jaw, a gift from a roadside bomb 2 decades ago. He carried the stillness of a man who'd seen too much, a silence that frightened people who hadn't. On the passenger seat lay Duke, his German shepherd, 6 years old, strong but showing hints of gray around the muzzle. The dog's coat gleamed bronze and black under the sunlight, his amber eyes sharp and alert. Duke had been with Tom since Afghanistan, a military canine once trained to detect explosives, now retired but no less vigilant. They'd both survived things that had taken others, and both carried ghosts that never quite left. Tom reached out and rested a calloused hand on Duke's neck. "We're almost there, buddy," he murmured, though even he wasn't sure where there really was. He hadn't planned to leave home that morning, but when his late wife's family, polite faces turned cold, told him it was time to move on, Tom had felt something in him finally give. Sarah's brother, Paul Hensley, had been the one to say it. Paul was younger, fit in the smug way of small-town bankers, his dark hair always slicked back, his shirt sleeves rolled to show forearms he never really used. He'd looked at Tom with that blend of pity and dismissal reserved for broken men. "Sarah's gone, Tom," Paul had said. "You can't just haunt that house forever." And behind him, their mother, Mrs. Hensley, a thin woman with tight lips and pearl earrings, had simply looked away. Tom had packed a single duffel bag, grabbed Duke's leash, and walked out without another word. The truck's fuel gauge trembled near empty. Tom rolled down a steep hill and spotted a rusted sign that read, Swannanoa Valley, 6 miles. His father had once owned land there, a small cabin built before Tom was born. He hadn't seen it since the funeral, over 20 years ago. The memory rose unbidden. His father, Robert Carter, a broad-shouldered man with a quiet authority, standing on that porch one evening, the mountains behind him soaked in blue twilight. "If the world ever pushes you out, son," he'd said, "that cabin'll still be standing. It's not much, but it's yours." At the time, Tom had laughed it off. Now, with $60 in his pocket and nowhere to go, it felt like the only thing left. The late afternoon light turned golden as he turned off the main road. Duke lifted his head, sniffing the air. The smell of hot pine and dry earth filled the cab. Tom followed the dirt trail until the forest thickened, the road narrowing until branches scraped the sides of the truck. Finally, the cabin appeared, half hidden by vines and the shadows of old trees. The roof sagged in the middle, and one shutter hung loose, clattering softly in the wind. It looked smaller than he remembered, more fragile, but somehow still alive. Tom stepped out, boots sinking into the dry grass. The cicadas screamed in the heat. Duke jumped down to visit him, tail low, but wagging cautiously. "Home, huh?" Tom said quietly. The word felt strange on his tongue. He walked up the porch steps, one cracked under his weight, and reached for the door handle. It was locked. The metal felt warm, almost hot. He glanced around, noticing faint footprints in the dirt, too fresh to be his own. Someone had been here recently. Breaking the door's weak latch was easy. The air inside was thick and stale, heavy with dust and something else, a faint smell of oil, maybe smoke. Furniture draped in cobwebs still stood where his father had left it. The old radio on the mantel, the wooden clock frozen at 11:42, a faded photograph of his parents smiling under the oak tree. Time hadn't moved here. It had simply stopped breathing. Duke sniffed the corners, then froze, ears erect, eyes fixed on the floor near the old fireplace. He gave a low, uncertain growl. Tom followed the dog's gaze. A section of the wooden floorboards was darker than the rest, marked by a long, thin crack that stretched toward the hearth. Kneeling, he touched it. The wood was cool, almost damp despite the heat outside. He pressed lightly. It gave a hollow echo, deep and strange. Duke stepped closer, tail stiff, muscles tense. For a moment, Tom thought he heard something beneath. A faint metallic clink, like a chain shifting in the dark. He straightened slowly, the air in the room suddenly heavier. Outside, thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the ridgeline, though the sky remained clear. Tom exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck, and muttered to himself, "Just the wood settling." But the way Duke's ears stayed pinned, the way those amber eyes locked on that one spot, it didn't feel like the house was settling at all. It felt like it was waking up. By the time Tom reached the heart of Swannanoa Valley, the sun had dropped behind the Blue Ridge, leaving long streaks of gold bleeding into violet dusk. The truck rattled over a narrow bridge where rust flaked like dry skin from its railings, and the smell of iron hung thick in the air. The sound of cicadas faded, replaced by the low drone of night settling in. Duke shifted on the seat, restless. The dog's ears twitched toward the woods, every nerve alert, as though the land itself carried an unfamiliar scent. Tom tightened his grip on the wheel. Something about returning here felt less like going home and more like walking back into someone else's unfinished story. The cabin sat on a gentle rise beyond a cluster of oaks, its silhouette framed against the dimming sky. The sign over the porch still read Carter's Hill, made from his father's old license plate. The paint had peeled to a dull gray, and a hornet's nest clung to its edge. Tom killed the engine and stepped out. The air was heavy with the smell of sap and distant rain. He could hear the creek below, murmuring like a forgotten voice. He climbed the steps slowly, his boots leaving prints in the fine dust that had settled thick over the years. Duke followed, tail low, sniffing each board before stepping forward. Inside, the cabin looked just as it had before. Old furniture, peeling wallpaper, and the faint trace of tobacco smoke that had long ago seeped into the wood. But tonight, there was something else. A subtle shift in the air. A sense of being watched. Tom brushed it off. He unpacked a few things, a flashlight, a canteen, an old photograph of Sarah in a wooden frame. She was smiling in that photo, standing by the river in early spring, tall and slim, her chestnut hair pulled back loosely, skin pale from the hospital months, yet still glowing with warmth. Losing her had taken the last of Tom's light. She'd been the one who pulled him back from the war inside his head, the one who reminded him to live like peace was possible. Without her, even silence had turned against him. As night thickened, Tom lit the wood stove. The flames painted the walls with flickering light. Duke lay near the hearth, eyes half closed but still alert. Tom sat in his father's old chair, the one with the leather armrest cracked from years of use. His gaze lingered on a small metal box on the mantel, the kind used to hold nails or screws. When he opened it, he found only dust and a single brass key. The key was smooth, old, its bow engraved with an R.C., Robert Carter, his father's initials. Tom turned it over in his palm, feeling a strange unease. What had his father locked away? A noise outside snapped him upright. Duke was already standing, ears sharp, head turned toward the door. Tom reached for the flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The yard was dark, lit only by the faint moonlight filtering through the pines. The wind had died, but something else stirred, a soul. Faint crunch of gravel near the shed behind the cabin. "Who's there?" Tom called out, his voice steady but low. Silence. Then Duke barked once, deep and warning. Tom moved slowly toward the shed, his boots sinking into damp earth. The door creaked as he pulled it open. Inside, the beam of light cut through dust and cobwebs. Tools hung on the wall, their metal heads catching the glint. An old plow, a rusted chainsaw, a cracked lantern, and footprints. Clear, recent footprints in the dust. Someone had been here, and recently. Tom crouched, studying them. They were boot prints, smaller than his, likely a man's but not heavy set. The trail led to the back wall, where a loose panel leaned outward. Behind it, only darkness. He hesitated, heart thudding. Duke growled softly beside him. When Tom pressed the panel, it swung open with a groan, revealing a narrow gap barely wide enough for a person to slip through. A faint draft brushed his face, cool and metallic. It smelled like the basement. He backed out slowly, shut the shed door, and latched it tight. Returning inside, he poured himself a cup of water from the canteen, hands trembling slightly. Duke hadn't moved from the fireplace, but was watching him closely, head tilted. "It's fine," Tom said quietly. "Just some kid messing around." But the words rang hollow. He sat again, the key still in his hand, and stared into the fire until the flames blurred. Sometime past midnight, the wind picked up. It howled through the trees, scraping the eaves. The cabin creaked in reply, boards shifting, as though the whole structure sighed. Tom drifted between waking and sleep, his mind caught in the space between memory and dream. He saw his father again, standing by the shed, holding a lantern. "If the day ever comes," Robert's voice echoed, "you'll know where to look." Tom jolted awake, sweat cold on his forehead. The fire had gone out. Duke was standing again, this time by the trapdoor in the kitchen floor, the one that led to the basement. His tail was stiff, his body tense. He barked once, sharply, then stared down at the wood. Tom listened. At first, nothing. Then, there it was. That same faint sound he'd heard earlier. A metallic rattle from beneath, steady and deliberate, like someone moving in the dark below. He rose slowly, every instinct alert, and stepped closer. The air seemed to hum against his skin. "Easy, boy," he whispered, reaching for the flashlight again. The beam quivered over the trapdoor handle. It was old iron, rusted but solid. He knelt, ear close to the wood. Another sound followed, a scraping, then silence. For a long moment, neither man nor dog moved. The night pressed close against the windows, the forest utterly still. Then, from somewhere deep beneath the floor, came a single sharp knock. One, then another, then nothing. Tom stayed frozen, heart hammering, the key clutched tight in his palm. The morning came soft and gray, the kind of stillness that hangs after a restless night. Tom hadn't slept. The sound from beneath the floor echoed in his mind long after it stopped. The first rays of sun filtered through the warped blinds, painting stripes across the dust-filled air. Duke had stayed alert all night, dozing lightly but waking at every creak. Now he lay by the door, chin on his paws, eyes tracking every movement his master made. Tom poured black coffee into a chipped mug, the bitter smell cutting through the damp air. He stood for a while, staring out of the window at the woods beyond, their green edges fading into a pale mist. He decided to clean, partly to occupy his mind, partly to see what else this house might reveal. Dust covered every surface, and the floor groaned under his weight. He started in the main room, lifting furniture piece by piece, sweeping the years away. The act felt both foreign and familiar, like waking up in someone else's dream. When he reached the old oak table, his hand froze. There, etched faintly into the wood, were parallel grooves, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. They led toward the far wall where the faded rug lay half-rolled at one corner. Duke noticed, too, the dog's nose pressed against the fabric, his body tense. Tom crouched beside him and lifted the rug. A square outline appeared beneath, metal, dull with age. The trapdoor. The latch was rusted, but a faint smear of oil glistened in the morning light. Someone had been here, and recently. Tom's pulse quickened. He pressed his ear against the metal, listening. Nothing now, only silence. He ran his thumb over the key in his pocket, the one with his father's initials. Could it fit? The key slid easily into the small keyhole beside the latch. The lock turned with a reluctant click. A stale gust of air rushed out as Tom pulled the hatch open. Wooden steps descended into a darkness that smelled of wet earth and iron. Duke whined softly, but didn't back away. Tom switched on his flashlight. The beam trembled down the stairs, illuminating cobwebs and a narrow passage lined with stone. Each step creaked under his boots, the wood brittle with age. Halfway down, the temperature dropped sharply. He could hear water dripping somewhere. At the bottom, the basement opened into a small room, walls of old brick slick with moisture. Tools were scattered across a workbench, wrenches, bolts, and a lantern long out of fuel. But what drew his attention was the glint of metal in the far corner. An iron safe, waist-high, its surface scarred and rusted. On the front, barely legible through grime, were engraved letters. Robert Carter, 1952. Tom's throat tightened. He traced the name with his finger. "Dad," he whispered. Duke sniffed around the edges, tail wagging uncertainly. Tom tugged at the handle, locked. He tried the same key, but it didn't fit. He searched the workbench drawers and found only old nails, papers, turned to mush and a crumpled photograph, his father standing beside two men in coveralls, their faces half shaded. One man was taller, bald, with a deep scar down his neck. The other had narrow eyes and a smile that didn't reach them. On the back, written faintly in pencil, Blue Ridge Project, 1951. He tucked the photo into his pocket. The words sounded familiar. His father had once mentioned working for a mining company in the mountains, but only briefly. Just old government work, he'd said, and changed the subject. Tom remembered that tone, the one that meant, don't ask again. A faint thump echoed overhead. Tom spun around, flashlight slicing across the room. Duke barked sharply, the sound ricocheting off the walls. Tom waited, every muscle drawn tight. Then he heard it, footsteps, faint but deliberate, moving across the floorboards above. He switched off the light, standing in the darkness, listening. The steps paused directly over the trapdoor. His heart pounded so loud he thought whoever was up there would hear it. After a long minute, silence returned. Then a car engine started somewhere outside. Tires crunched on gravel, fading into the distance. Whoever it was, they'd been close. Tom climbed back up, closing the hatch quietly behind him. He stepped out onto the porch, scanning the tree line. The forest looked innocent in the daylight, sunlight flickering through branches, but he could feel the presence of someone watching, or something. His gaze caught movement on the road below, a red pickup disappearing around the bend. He exhaled slowly, tension coiling in his shoulders. The house felt different now, heavier, as though every nail and beam was holding its breath. He turned the key in his hand, feeling its weight. The safe would have to wait. Later that afternoon, while repairing a window latch, Tom saw an old man walking up the path from the valley. The stranger wore a denim jacket and carried a cane made from polished cedar. His frame was lean but upright, and his face, though lined deep, held an alert sharpness. "Didn't expect to see anyone up here," the man called out, voice gravelly but warm. Tom straightened. "Just fixing what's left of my father's place." The man nodded. "Name's Harris. Lived down by the creek since '78. Your dad used to lend me his tools." His gray beard was trimmed short, his eyes pale blue like winter sky. There was something unhurried about him, a steadiness earned from years of quiet work. "Place has been empty a long time," he added, glancing toward the cabin. "Strange things, though. Lights at night. Folks say they hear digging." Tom felt the words settle uneasily. "You ever see anyone?" Harris shook his head. "Only shadows. But your father, he was a good man. Kept to himself, but there were stories back then. About what he was working on before he passed." Tom frowned. "Stories?" The old man's gaze drifted toward the woods. "Best you stay careful, son. Some things buried here were meant to stay that way." Then he tipped his cap and turned down the trail, leaving Tom with more questions than before. That night, as twilight bled across the valley, Tom stood on the porch, watching the horizon burn gold and violet. The safe waited below, locked and silent, but his father's name now felt less like comfort and more like a warning. Duke sat at his side, ears tilted toward the woods, the same woods that now seemed to breathe. When the wind rose, it carried the faintest sound, metal striking stone, deep and far beneath the ground. The morning after his talk with Harris came with a pale light, thin and hesitant, like the valley itself was unsure whether to wake. Mist clung to the trees, rolling through the branches like breath. Tom sat at the kitchen table with the safe beside him. The metal box was heavier than it looked, the hinges stubborn from decades of rust. He'd spent most of the night staring at it, feeling the unease settle deeper in his chest. Duke had slept near the door, ears flicking every time the wind moved. Now, as Tom pried the last hinge loose with a chisel and hammer, the dog lifted his head and watched, tail motionless. The lock finally gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the quiet cabin. Inside, there was no gold, no treasure, only a stack of envelopes tied together with brittle twine, a small leather notebook, and a folded sheet of paper with his father's handwriting. The sight of that script, neat, steady, painfully familiar, froze Tom for a long moment. His father, Robert Carter, had been a man of few words, one whose silence carried weight. His handwriting had always reflected that. Disciplined strokes, every letter deliberate. Tom unfolded the letter with trembling hands. "If you are reading this, son, then I'm long gone. There are things I've left behind that you were never meant to find, but maybe now you must. Carter's Hill holds more than memory. It holds consequence. What you choose to do with what you find will define whether the Carter name ends with me or begins again with you. Some debts can't be buried, only carried, until someone brave enough decides to lift them. The words were simple, but each carried the weight of a secret too long held. Beneath the letter was the notebook, its pages stiff with age. Inside, his father's writing turned from steady to hurried. Maps, coordinates, references to Blue Ridge Mineral Survey 1949, Section 14B, Copper Yield Inconclusive, and Operation Willow. Tom frowned. He remembered once, as a child, hearing two men visit his father late at night, men in dark coats with clipped voices. His father had called them government contractors. Now he wondered if that had ever been true. Duke stirred, letting out a low rumble. His gaze fixed toward the window. Tom followed it. A figure was walking up the path. The silhouette moved slowly but with purpose, carrying a canvas satchel over one shoulder. As the person drew closer, Tom recognized her. Margaret Lane, the postmaster's widow. She was in her late 60s, small-framed but sturdy, with sharp cheekbones and silver hair pinned back neatly. Her face was tanned and lined from years of work in the mountain sun, but her pale green eyes still held the brisk clarity of someone who saw through excuses. She'd been one of the few people kind to the Carters when his father passed. "Morning, Tom," she called softly from the porch. "Didn't expect to see life up here again." Tom opened the door, the letter still in his hand. "Morning, Margaret. Just cleaning up what's left." She stepped inside without hesitation, her boots squeaking on the warped boards. "This place always smelled like pine and secrets," she said with a faint smile. Then her eyes fell on the open safe, and the papers spread across the table. "Your father's work?" Tom nodded. "Looks like it. Something about Blue Ridge mining surveys. You ever hear anything about that?" Margaret hesitated. Back then, everyone around here knew there was digging in those hills, not all of it legal. Some said the Army was testing new equipment after the war. Others said your father found something worth more than copper. She lowered her voice. Whatever it was, people disappeared after asking questions. He kept to himself for good reason. Her tone carried both warning and sympathy. She reached into her satchel and handed Tom a small envelope, yellowed at the corners. "This came through my hands years ago. Your father mailed it to himself, marked, 'Hold in case of death.' The return address was the mining office in Raleigh. I didn't have the heart to throw it away." Tom stared at the envelope. His name was written on it, not his father's handwriting, but someone else's, slanted, elegant, almost feminine. He slid a finger under the flap. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "The files are not lost. They were moved. Section 14B, beneath the survey chamber." No signature, no date. Margaret looked uneasy. "Tom, I'd be careful where you dig, literally. Men came through here about a month ago. Outsiders. They asked about your father's property. One of them had a scar along his neck." Tom's stomach tightened. The man from the photograph, the same scar. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into the notebook. "Did they say what they wanted?" "They said they were historians," she replied, "but they looked more like men who made history disappear." He thanked her, walked her back to the porch. Before leaving, she placed a hand on his arm. "Your daddy loved you, Tom. Whatever he was mixed up in, he meant to protect you from it. Don't let curiosity undo what he sacrificed." As she disappeared down the hill path, the valley fell quiet again. Tom stood for a while, watching the mist settle over the trees. The words from the letter echoed in his mind. Carter's Hill holds more than memory. He went back inside, closing the door behind him. Duke was sitting by the trapdoor, nose to the crack, listening. Tom knelt beside him, resting a hand on the dog's shoulder. "What are you hearing, boy?" Then he heard it too, faint, rhythmic, unmistakable. 3 slow knocks from beneath the floor. Not wind, not the house. Each one deliberate, spaced like a message. Tom reached for the lantern, heart pounding. Somewhere below, in the damp darkness of his father's basement, someone or something was still there. Rain came suddenly that night, heavy and warm, hammering against the tin roof like drumming fingers of something ancient and restless. Summer storms were rare in June, but the sky over Swannanoa cracked open without warning, and the valley drank greedily. Tom stood at the window, watching the lightning flicker behind the ridges. Each flash revealed the glistening outlines of trees, their leaves trembling in silver light. Duke paced near the back door, tail stiff, nose pressed to the gap beneath it. The dog's hackles were raised. He had caught something beyond the storm. Tom grabbed his flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The air was thick with rain and the smell of wet soil. Duke darted into the yard, barking sharply toward the far end of the property where the ground sloped toward the old orchard. Tom followed, boots sinking into the mud. "Easy, boy," he called, but Duke kept digging, claws tearing into the earth with desperate urgency. The spot he'd chosen wasn't random. It aligned almost perfectly with a coordinate marked in his father's notebook. 14B, Ridge Base. Kneeling beside the dog, Tom used a rusted shovel he had found near the shed. Each scoop unearthed more of what looked like packed stone. Beneath an inch of soil, the shovel hit metal with a hollow clang. He cleared away the dirt, revealing a circular plate of concrete framed with iron. In its center was a handle sealed with corrosion. Duke barked once, then backed away, whining softly. Tom wiped the rain from his face and gripped the handle. It resisted, then groaned as it gave way. A rush of air escaped, thick, metallic, and stale with the scent of long confinement. The opening revealed a narrow shaft descending into darkness, lined with concrete steps, slick from condensation. A faint draft carried the odor of rust and mold. Tom hesitated, shining the beam of his flashlight down. The light caught on something reflective, metal, maybe steel piping or equipment. "Stay here," he told Duke, but the shepherd whined and followed it as Tom descended. The air grew cooler, heavy with the weight of years. At the bottom, the passage opened into a low chamber, no bigger than a small garage. Wooden crates lined one wall, their edges dark with age but intact. Each was stenciled with fading letters, Blue Ridge Mining Co. Some bore the red stamp classified, property of U.S. government. Tom crouched beside one and brushed away the grime. The crate was sealed with brass clasps, still gleaming faintly despite the decades. He pried one open with the edge of his shovel. Inside were cylindrical metal tubes, each wrapped in waxed paper. He pulled one free and felt its weight, surprisingly heavy for its size. Stamped along the side were faint letters. Survey Instrument, 1950, Experimental Prototype. He turned to another crate. This one contained folders sealed in plastic, marked Project Willow, Section 14B, Restricted. The documents inside were brittle but legible. Reports of soil tests, radiation readings, geological anomalies. He scanned the pages under the flashlight, trying to make sense of it. "What the hell were you into, Dad?" he murmured. A sound broke the silence, faint footsteps from above, muffled by rain. Tom froze. Duke's ears perked, body rigid. The footsteps stopped near the opening, then retreated, fading into the storm. Someone had been watching them. Tom stuffed several folders into his backpack and started back up. When he emerged, the rain had eased into a steady drizzle. The night air shimmered with humidity, crickets resuming their song as if nothing had happened. But the unease lingered like a weight between his shoulder blades. He replaced the metal cover, covering it with mud and leaves until it blended into the ground. Whoever was searching for these crates wouldn't find them easily. Back inside, he spread the documents across the kitchen table. The papers detailed a series of mining operations, funded jointly by private investors and a government research branch. But near the end, one memo stood out. It was dated June 1952, the year carved into his father's safe, and bore a signature, R. Carter, lead technician. The memo described a containment breach in Shaft 14B involving hazardous airborne material. The project was halted indefinitely, and all assets were ordered sealed. Tom leaned back, rubbing his temples. His father hadn't been hiding treasure. He'd been hiding evidence. The Blue Ridge Mining Company hadn't just mined copper. They'd been testing something else, something dangerous. And now, decades later, someone wanted it uncovered. The floor creaked behind him. Duke lifted his head, growling softly. Tom turned. A shape flickered past the window, dark and fast. He rushed outside, flashlight slicing through rain. At the edge of the clearing, tire tracks glistened fresh in the mud. A vehicle had been there recently. A truck, based on the depth and spacing of the tracks. His heart raced as he followed them toward the main road, but they ended abruptly near the creek, washed out by rain. Whoever had come had left quickly. When he returned to the porch, a movement caught his eye. An envelope pinned to the doorframe with a rusted nail. The paper was soaked, but still legible. In bold block letters, "Stop digging. Some doors don't close twice." Tom stood motionless, rain dripping from his hair. Duke pressed against his leg, whining low. He tore the note free and stared into the darkness beyond the trees. Lightning flashed once more, and for a split second, he thought he saw someone watching from the ridge, tall, unmoving, face obscured by the rain. Then the light vanished, and so did the figure. The next morning broke unnaturally quiet. Even the birds seemed to have retreated from the trees. The air hung heavy with that post-storm stillness when the earth smells of metal and secrets. Tom was fixing the porch rail when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A black SUV rolled to a stop by the gate, its windows tinted so dark they swallowed the reflection of daylight. Duke lifted his head and gave a low growl, deep and instinctive. Two men stepped out. The first was tall and sharply built, wearing a gray suit that seemed out of place in the mud. His hair was dark and slicked back, his face angular, clean-shaven, but the lines around his mouth spoke of someone used to giving orders. The other man was bulkier, older, maybe in his late 50s, with a rough beard streaked white, a face sunburned from years outdoors, and a small scar under his left eye. The tall man smiled, the kind of smile that looked rehearsed. "Mr. Carter," he called out, extending a hand. "I'm Victor Hale. This is my associate, Mr. Brandt. We're representatives of Ridgefield Minerals, a company managing historical mining sites across western North Carolina. I believe we may have mutual interests." Tom didn't shake his hand. "Don't recall inviting anyone." Hale chuckled lightly, as if he expected resistance. "We received word there might be, let's say, certain materials of interest located on this property. Archival, geological, possibly hazardous. We'd like to take a look, for safety reasons." Tom wiped his hands on a rag, meeting the man's gaze. "Safety's fine, but this land isn't for sale, and nobody digs here without my say." Brandt, the older man, shifted his weight. His eyes were small and pale, like glass chips under his heavy brow. "You don't understand, Mr. Carter. What's down there ain't just yours. It's government property, left over from the old Blue Ridge project." Tom's pulse tightened. He kept his tone even. "You got a warrant?" Hale's smile faded slightly. "We're not here to strong-arm anyone. Just a conversation. Perhaps an offer." He slipped a card from his coat pocket and placed it on the porch rail. "Our company would be prepared to purchase the land and all assets beneath it for a fair price. Say, $200,000. Tom glanced at the card but didn't pick it up. "You think waving a number's gonna make me forget my father died guarding this place?" A flicker passed over Hale's face. Surprise, maybe respect. He nodded curtly. "Then I suppose we'll be in touch." The men returned to their SUV. The engine hummed to life, tires hissing on the wet road as they disappeared down the hill. Duke barked once, sharp and unsettled. Tom stood there long after the sound faded, that business card still gleaming faintly against the wood. That night, the valley was restless again. The wind had turned humid, carrying the scent of honeysuckle and something sourer. Oil, maybe, or gasoline. Tom was half asleep on the couch when Duke's growl cut through the dark. Not the uncertain sound of a dog hearing a raccoon, but a low, dangerous rumble that came from deep in his chest. Tom grabbed his flashlight and the old revolver he kept by the drawer. Duke bolted toward the back door, fur bristling. Tom followed, moving quietly across the creaking floor. A faint clatter echoed outside, the sound of metal against glass. He flicked the light on, its beam slicing through the darkness. A shadow darted across the yard. Tom ran out just as Duke lunged. There was a snarl, a shout, and the crash of something falling. The intruder stumbled toward the tree line, clutching his arm. Duke's teeth caught fabric, ripping through it before the man broke free and vanished into the woods. Tom knelt beside the porch where Duke stood, panting. On the wooden step lay a streak of blood and a torn piece of paper clutched in the dirt. He picked it up carefully. The rain had smudged some of the ink, but 3 words were still legible. "The shares still exist." Tom stared at it, the words echoing through him. Shares. The letter from his father had spoken of debts and legacies. Could it mean ownership? Rights to the Blue Ridge Mining Company itself? He remembered the classified crates, the signatures, and the strange mention of private investors. What if his father hadn't been just an engineer, but a partner? He brought the scrap inside, set it beside the open notebook, and studied his father's entries again. In one margin, almost invisible under faded pencil lines, he saw a note. All contracts secured, 5% equity sealed with deposit. His father had owned shares in a company now worth millions, perhaps more. And if those shares had never been claimed, They were still his by blood. The realization hit him like a cold current. The men weren't after buried equipment. They were after ownership, the legal remnants of a company reborn under new names. The mining empire still existed, and Robert Carter's forgotten stake had resurfaced. A noise outside snapped his attention back. Headlights flashed once through the window, then vanished. Someone was watching from the road again. Tom reached for his revolver, checking the cylinder. Duke stood beside him, muscles taut, eyes glowing faintly in the lamplight. "Looks like we're not done yet, boy," he whispered. "Not by a long shot." Thunder rolled again, far away over the mountains, but this time it didn't sound like a storm. It sounded like something moving closer. Dawn crept slowly over the valley, spilling pale gold through the mist that still clung to the ridges. Tom hadn't slept. The paper with the words, "The shares still exist," lay beside his coffee mug, the ink smudged but clear enough to haunt him. He'd spent the night gathering every document from the crates and his father's notebook, wrapping them carefully in oilcloth. The decision came quietly, as high, like a tide turning in his chest. It was time to find out what his father had been protecting. By the time the first sunlight touched Carter's Hill, Tom was already on the road to Asheville. The old Ford rattled along the mountain curves, its tires hissing against damp asphalt. Duke sat in the passenger seat, head out of the window, tongue flicking at the wind. Tom's mind replayed the encounter with Hale and Brandt, their words dripping with polite menace. He knew they'd be back. Whatever his father left behind wasn't just property, it was leverage. He pulled into downtown Asheville just after 8. The air smelled of rain and roasted coffee from the cafes opening their doors. The office of Patricia Monroe, attorney at law, sat above a bookstore, a narrow space with brick walls and tall windows overlooking the street. He climbed the stairs, documents under his arm. Patricia greeted him at the door, her expression softening with recognition. She was in her late 50s, slender but strong, her hair iron gray pulled into a low twist, her sharp eyes framed by thin-rimmed glasses. Years of courtroom battles had carved a quiet authority into her voice. "Tom Carter," she said, gesturing him inside, "I haven't seen you since that veterans benefits case back in 2014. What brings you in this early?" He laid the bundle on her desk. "Something my father left behind, and something people are willing to kill for." Her brows rose slightly. She untied the cloth, examining the folders and handwritten notes. "Blue Ridge Mining Company," she murmured, flipping through the first report. "Haven't heard that name in decades." "They came to my property yesterday. 2 men. Said they worked for Ridgefield Minerals. Offered to buy me out. Then someone broke into my house last night." Patricia's eyes sharpened. "And they left you breathing? That's already a miracle." She began sorting through the papers with practiced precision, scanning signatures, dates, and seals. Her voice shifted from casual to measured. "Your father, Robert Carter? This is his handwriting?" Tom nodded. "Yeah, every line of it." Patricia leaned back in her chair. "You said he died in 1989? Stroke. Found him out by the orchard." She opened a separate folder containing typewritten contracts, the company's founding documents, and an original memorandum stamped "Confidential, 1946. "Well," she said slowly, "you're not going to believe this. According to these, your father wasn't just an employee of Blue Ridge Mining. He was one of its founders, a minority partner, but a founder nonetheless." Tom stared at her. "That can't be right. He never—" "It's all here," Patricia interrupted gently, tapping the signature line. "Robert Carter, co-signer of the 1946 Articles of Incorporation. And right here, equity division, 3.2% held privately by Robert Carter, with full inheritable rights. These shares were never sold, transferred, or dissolved." She paused, looking up at him. "Tom, your father owned 3.2% of one of the largest private mining companies in the country. At today's valuation, that's north of $250 million. The words hit him like a blow. The office seemed to tilt. 250? He sat back, dazed. "My father, he lived like a man who barely had enough to fix his truck." Patricia folded her hands, studying him. "Some people hide money for greed, others hide it for protection. Given the names on these contracts, I'd say your father was the latter." She turned one document toward him. At the bottom, beside his father's signature, was another. "Victor Hale, finance officer." Tom's breath caught. "Hale? The same Hale who came to my door yesterday." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "If it's the same man, or his son. That family's been tied to mining money for generations. They've rebranded the company multiple times, but the ownership traces back here. They likely assumed Carter's shares were forgotten, or that no heir would surface to claim them. You showing up threatens their entire structure. Tom rubbed his temple, the puzzle snapping together in grim clarity. So, that's why they want the land. Not for what's underground, for what it represents on paper. Patricia nodded. Exactly. If these shares are validated and you file claim through probate court, you become a stakeholder. They can't touch Carter's Hill or any connected mineral rights without your consent. But make no mistake, Tom. Once you file, they'll come harder. Quiet threats will turn into legal and possibly physical ones. You'll need protection and witnesses. Duke, who had been lying by the door, lifted his head as if sensing the weight in her tone. Patricia smiled faintly at him. That dog of yours still a good judge of character? Tom managed a small grin. Better than I ever was. She tapped in the documents together into a neat stack. I'll start the verification process today. Chain of title, stock history, everything. But you keep these originals safe until I give you the word. And Tom, she hesitated, her eyes softening. Whatever your father did, it wasn't to hide from you. He was hiding you from them. Tom looked out the window where the morning sun had broken through the mist, lighting the rooftops of Asheville in soft gold. For the first time, the truth didn't feel like relief. It felt like inheritance wrapped in danger. Somewhere in the reflection of the glass, he could almost see his father's face, weary but defiant. I guess he taught me how to fight after all, Tom murmured. Patricia gave a thin smile. Then you'd better start remembering. 2 months passed, and summer ripened across the valley like honey poured over the hills. The heat returned with its steady hum of cicadas. The grass grew tall and golden, and the house at Carter's Hill no longer looked abandoned. Fresh paint glowed faintly under the sunlight, the porch repaired, the windows clear again. Tom sat there one morning with a mug of coffee in his hand, the steam curling like smoke into the warm air. Duke chased butterflies across the yard, his coat gleaming bronze under the light. The dog had aged, but his spirit hadn't dimmed. There was a quiet pride in the way he trotted, as if he understood that they had both survived something meant to break them. Tom's life had changed, but in ways that didn't glitter. When the settlement finalized, Patricia handed him a check large enough to change any man's life, the official purchase of his 3.2% shares. He'd stared at the paper for a long time, feeling a hollow awe rather than triumph. It wasn't wealth that filled him, it was relief. The ghosts of Carter's Hill were finally at peace. The company could no longer bury his father's name or the truth. He didn't buy a new car, didn't move to the city. Instead, he hired local craftsmen to restore the property. The old safe stayed where it was, cleaned and sealed, behind glass. The basement beneath, once a place of fear, became a small memorial chamber, lined with framed photographs, copies of his father's documents, and the letter that had started it all. Visitors sometimes came, veterans, neighbors, curious locals. Tom never charged anyone to see it. He called it the quiet room, a space to remember that some men fought their battles in silence. Patricia visited often during the renovations. The lawyer's sharpness had softened. She now wore her gray hair loose, often bringing her rescue terrier, Maggie, who trailed Duke like a tiny shadow. You could have left all this behind, she'd told Tom once, standing by the porch. Bought a place on the coast, started over. Tom had smiled faintly. Some roots aren't meant to be pulled out. They just need water again. When the legal dust settled, he used part of the money to start something he had dreamed about quietly for years, Carter's Sanctuary, a retreat for veterans and retired service dogs. The property stretched over 10 acres, with fenced fields and wooden cabins built by volunteers. Word spread quickly through the local veteran community, and soon the sanctuary filled with stories and second chances. There was Raymond, a Marine amputee with a laugh that could cut through thunder, Elena, a former medic who had seen too much desert and too little home, and Scout, a scarred German shepherd rescued from an abandoned kennel who limped but never complained. Tom treated each of them with the quiet respect of a man who understood exactly where their silences came from. The sanctuary wasn't about fixing people. It was about giving them a place where they didn't have to be fixed. Each evening he'd walk the fields with Duke, sometimes joined by Raymond or Elena, their laughter carried on the wind like something sacred. One morning, a black sedan stopped by the gate. For a tense heartbeat, Tom thought it might be Hale again, or someone wearing the same kind of polished threat. But when the driver stepped out, it was a younger man, maybe 30, clean cut, in jeans and a work shirt. He introduced himself as Michael Hale, Victor Hale's son. His voice was quiet, his eyes blue like the summer sky, but heavy with shame. "I came to say something my father never would," he said. "What happened back then, what our company did to your father, it was wrong. I can't change the past, but I can help set things right." Tom studied him for a long moment. The man's face was honest in its unease, his hands trembling slightly. "Then start by not forgetting," Tom said finally, "and make sure your children don't either." Michael nodded, left a donation envelope for the sanctuary, and drove away. Duke barked once at the fading car, then lay down at Tom's feet as if satisfied. That evening, the sun bled orange over the fields. The rebuilt barn glowed warm, and laughter drifted from where the veterans were grilling supper. The wind carried the smell of pine and grilled meat, of home reclaimed. Tom sat on the porch, watching Duke roll in the grass, chasing nothing and everything. Above the door hung the same wooden sign his father had carved decades ago, Carter's Hill, the letters worn smooth by time but still proud. He looked at it for a long moment, the air thick with that golden hush that comes just before sunset. "Dad," he murmured, his voice steady, "I've found it. Not the gold, not the shares, the thing you wanted me to see. It was never about what you left behind. It was about what you refused to let go of." The wind stirred, gentle, carrying the sound of laughter from the fields and Duke's joyful bark echoing into the valley. The sun sank behind the hills, turning everything to gold. And for the first time in a long time, Tom Carter felt that both his father's story and his own had found their ending. Sometimes, the miracles we pray for don't arrive as flashes of light or voices from the heavens. Sometimes, they come quietly, in the form of a loyal dog that won't give up, a letter left behind by a father who still believes in his son, or a home once broken now, filled with laughter again. Tom Carter never asked for wealth. What he found was grace, the kind that rebuilds what loss tried to destroy. And maybe that's how God works, not by changing the world around us, but by stirring the courage within us to make it right. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in second chances. Leave a comment below. Tell us who your Duke is, the one who stayed when everything else fell apart. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the quiet miracles that still walk among us. May God bless you, your home, and every soul who listens tonight. For sometimes, the smallest bark in the dark is His way of saying, "You are not alone."